Now, the boost formula has been synonymous with Sonic the Hedgehog for the past 15 years. Since Sonic Unleashed, this has been the main formula for Sonic games going forward, with a few exceptions. And with the release of Sonic X Shadow Generations, it's still going strong today. But there have been growing sentiments that people are getting tired of the boost formula. So has the formula really been milked for all it's worth, and is it time to move on? Or are people just over-exaggerating and saying it can do more with the boost formula, expanding upon it and making it better? But to understand this further, we need to take a step back and analyze why people are actually so upset with the boost formula nowadays and why they want it gone. Because it's not like the boost formula was unpopular from the start. In fact, it was quite the opposite. When the boost formula released, it was seen as a breath of fresh air from Sonic 06 and the adventure formula. It gave Sonic an identity different from that of his past by focusing in on the speed aspect of the character and building gameplay surrounding that. The goal was no longer to build the speed, it was to maintain it through fast reaction times. And I think this departure from core principles of Sonic gameplay is the first reason why people want the boost formula gone. And while Sonic Generations is actually a pretty good example of translating the 2D Sonic level design to 3D, a lot of the boost formula's ideas and mechanics aren't really that close to what was before. There's a very real argument to be made that the boost formula is just less complex and engaging than the classic formula and even the adventure formula. And with the franchise being in a much better place now, some would argue it's a perfect time to ditch the boost formula and go towards more momentum classic-based direction. And Sonic Frontiers being the last big mainline game, not counting Shadow Generations obviously, is kind of telling because Sonic Frontiers doesn't really use any of these classic formulas, instead puts the boost Sonic from our recent games into an open area. Obviously it's been tweaked and it does feel good to control, but there's still arguments to be made that why are we using the boost formula in an open world because it necessitates all this kind of automated level design, when this would have been the perfect time to introduce more terrain and movement-based platforming. And it looks like even Sonic Team themselves might be going in this direction, because in the Final Horizon they tested out a lot of this movement-based level design, which unfortunately wasn't exactly up to par, but it shows that they're working on it. Another reason to explain this could be the deterioration of the boost formula games. Now in my opinion, the boost formula peaked around Generations with near perfect level design and great controls for them, but there are obviously arguments for Colors and Unleashed as well. Unleashed has some really fast reactionary gameplay, and Colors slows it down a bit with some great platforming. But since then, the 3D games have, in my opinion, been taking a step back. Sonic Forces didn't have the level design quality or the controls of the previous games, and Sonic Frontiers is kind of its own thing, but unfortunately also disappoints. Especially with the latter, because it doesn't have the same reactionary speed-based gameplay or the good platforming of Sonic Generations and Colors. Can't help but feel like the game could have been so much better if they just shied away from the automation of the boost formula, instead of focusing in on it. The main argument in defense of this automation is that it makes the games more accessible to new players. That was a design choice that they took in Sonic Forces, where they wanted the player to feel more spectacle and fast in the rush of Sonic. This has persisted up to now, even to Shadow Generations, where the gameplay is now being interrupted by these mini cutscenes, which, don't get me wrong, look great, but I can't help but feel like they're being used to cover up the lack of engaging gameplay that you can come up with the boost formula anymore. But to the contrary of that, there have been fan games that take the boost and transform it into something that's more action-packed and movement-based. They mainly do this by removing the baggage of the boost formula and allowing you to carry your momentum over when doing actions like the homing attack, as well as instituting stuff like the bounce. And it's not just fan games either, it's even official games. Sonic Dream Team is actually one of the best examples of taking the boost and turning it into something more free-flowing. And this is especially shown in its implementation of the springs. In the boost formula games, the springs are usually kind of rigid, you're sent in one strict direction, and they're mostly used in automation. But in Sonic Dream Team, you can do all sorts of things with them. They're like these large extended platforms so you can bounce off of any direction, and it feels good to conserve your momentum. So it's clearly not logistically impossible to improve upon the boost formula even more. The problem with going in that direction is, if we're doing all of this, why not just stick with the adventure formula or something else that's kind of movement based that allows you to take even greater advantage of these new traits? But then there comes in another issue, and that is the issue of identity, because at this point the boost formula has been around longer than it hasn't been, and it's the main formula that people associate with Sonic games nowadays. It can be hard to give it up and say, oh, we're just moving on to the next thing like nothing ever happened. You could argue especially now that it wouldn't work the same as it did back from 2006 to 2008 with 06 to Unleashed, because at this point the Sonic series is more popular than it's kinda ever been. Well, barring the classics, obviously. This is what people, and especially this newer audience coming in from the movies, is going to see as Sonic's main style. And from Sega's perspective, why wouldn't they keep the boost formula? It's helping this newer audience get into Sonic easier than they would have before. It could also be argued that just because this team has been working with the boost gameplay for such a long time, that would be kinda hard to switch over to this completely new gameplay style. So it's kinda hard for Sonic Team right now because they have this formula, but it hasn't really reached the peaks it did in 2011. And even with games like Shadow Gens and Frontiers, trailers, which were considered to be successful, it's hard not to notice the amount of people who were crying for the automation to go. Sonic Team could try to move boost games to the side and keep them to their own spin-off series like Shadow Gens. That doesn't alleviate the issue that you're still alienating an audience that you've built up for a large amount of time. There's the potential alienation of this new audience that just couldn't understand how this new type of Sonic game would work, like we in the past didn't understand how the classic games work. I'm sure I'm not the only one who went through the canon event of getting 1 to 2 zones into every classic Sonic game and then just quitting. On their base level, Sonic games can be hard to pick up for new players, especially with the adventure games, and maybe even something like Unleashed. And this definitely isn't helped by Sonic Team's awful tutorials, which kinda deserve a video of their own. One idea I did see floating around though would be a combination of the two gameplay styles, something more movement-based combined with the boost formula. And there's a couple of ways you could go about this. My favorite proposal was tying the boost to its own button that's only accessible when you reach a certain speed cap, so it's like the Advanced 2 boost mode. This way, you're not alienating the people who want to use the environment and movement to build speed, but you're also not alienating the people who want to use the boost to plow through and use their reaction time to maintain it. Good players would be able to maintain their speed and keep the boost for as much of the level as possible through their quick reaction times. Another proposal was to use the boost to replace the max speed sections from Sonic 06 at the end of a level. This would also be a neat solution, but it runs the risk of alienating people who come to these games expecting something similar to the boost. I think that some combination of these two formulas might be the best way to go forward for Sonic Team, but it would undoubtedly also be one of the harder methods. No matter what Sonic Team does, it's always going to be a hard sell to just get rid of the boost formula outright for the previously mentioned reasons. They can't just throw it all away. They've been working on this for such a long time and it's become such a core identity for the series that getting rid of it would alienate a whole new generation of fans. And while there's always the argument that Sega literally did this by creating the boost formula in the first place, in that case it was just necessary to have a change. Now even myself, I personally want the boost formula to go, or at least be sidelined for a bit, to have a new game that's more focused on momentum-based gameplay. It's hard not to feel giddy at the potential of a fully realized Frontiers with movement-based platforming, but at the same time I don't even know if they could pull it off at this point, or whether they're going to in the first place. Weighing all of Sonic Team's decisions, it's kinda hard to see them getting rid of the boost formula, but at the same time it is possible. But for that, we're just gonna have to wait and see. And as for a brief update on where I've been, well, I've been to university and I've been studying for the first semester, so I couldn't make as many videos. Now that I'm on winter break, I can start uploading a lot more again, but don't be surprised to see uploads slow down once I go back for second semester. Thank you guys for being here with me all this time, and to great 2025. That's it for me, everyone, signing off.